In the 1920s, New York City had a problem. Penn Station. Opened in 1910, it was the crown jewel for the Pennsylvania Railroad. Serving trains from all over the country, Penn Station is one of the most important stations in the city. However, Penn Station was quickly reaching capacity. Built for a capacity of 73 million people annually, Penn Station would soon reach 109 million people annually by 1945. Now, this was a problem. Rising numbers of passengers means more trains are needed. But the number of trains were already maxed out at Penn Station. So, the New Jersey legislature created the North Jersey Transit Commission in 1922. They had one job: solve Penn Station's capacity problem. And the result was this: the report of the North Jersey Transit Commission to the Senate and General Assembly of New Jersey. In the report, the commission diagnosed the root cause of the capacity issue at Penn Station: its terminal operations. Being the endpoint of the vast majority of trains was extremely bad for operations and capacity. Penn Station's status as a rail terminal further amplifies this problem. Having trains end here means a complicated process where rail workers have to inspect and kick people off the train before sending them to the yard. That process occupies valuable space at Penn Station, increasing delays. And to fix it, the commission recommended an idea. And that idea was through running. Basically, instead of ending trains at Penn Station, trains would just continue on, past Manhattan and onto another suburb. By treating the central station as just another stop, there is no lengthy procedure that holds trains up at Penn Station, nor insane train switching nor yard moves, increasing capacity here a ton.
You're basically turning Penn Station from a parking lot to a highway.
Furthermore, the commission also wrote that by making these trains continue to another suburb, that once painful commute between the outer regions of New York would now be connected via a continuous transit line. And this idea was not new, even for the 1920s. Multiple cities around the world have been experimenting with the idea, like in Philly.
That's kind of where the Broad Ridge Spur comes in, why this weird stub this was going to be a loop. And it's exactly this. The engineer came in and said, "What are you doing? The most important thing is you got trains on this side, you got trains on this side, you run them through." And talking about through running in 1916.
Unfortunately for the commission, though, a myriad of historical events killed the report. But while the report remained shelved, the principle of through running did not die. For the next 100 years, a bunch of through running plans had been made, again and again and again. In fact, one such proposal, called the Metropolitan Transit District Compact, had the support of the governor of both New York and New Jersey. But as you can tell, that did not happen. And it's not like through running Penn Station is some ludicrous, ultra, foamer, T4000 type proposal. The tunnels for through running Penn Station already exist. And that would certainly be very useful, as even more service is scheduled to run into Penn Station in the following years. Or is it? This is the idea that could revolutionize Penn Station and New York City transit. So, before we begin, let's talk about some of the successes of through running. And no, I am not going to Paris or London. I'm poor. But also, I want to show that through running actually exists in New York City, in the form of subways. Specifically, this, the BMT Broadway line, and this, the Nassau Street line, between 1931 and 1967. And to explain all of this, let's go to Brooklyn in the 1860s and 70s. What you all know in South and East Brooklyn as the B, D, F, L, M, N, and Q trains, plus the Franklin Avenue Shuttle, were not actually once subway lines. These lines were actually once surface railroads in Brooklyn. Except they weren't even part of Brooklyn yet. They were separate towns. Consider them suburbs of Brooklyn. Anyway, these railroads would end near the East River. From there, ferries would take them to Manhattan. Now, this was inconvenient, as ferries were slow and unreliable. And while these railroads eventually were bought out by the Brooklyn Rapid Transit Company, or BRT, converted them into trolleys, and were extended to the Lower East Side of Manhattan, it wasn't enough. These new terminals were packed to the brim with trains, especially Park Row, where it was nicknamed the Brooklyn Bridge Crush. Meanwhile, in the borough next door to Brooklyn is Queens. Queens had the opposite problem. Very few people lived here, but the city wanted to develop Queens to expand the housing market and decrease the density of the Lower East Side. But the LIRR, which operated in Queens, was not enough. More train lines in Queens were needed. So during the dual contract negotiations, the Brooklyn Rapid Transit Company proposed to take their surface railroad and trolley lines, grade separate them to subway standards, and link them into a Brooklyn Central subway under 4th Avenue, Flatbush Avenue, and downtown Brooklyn. Meanwhile, in Queens, 2 new elevated train lines will be constructed, one to Astoria, the other to Flushing. Finally, a brand new subway in Manhattan under Broadway, 59th, and 60th Street will connect these lines together. In Brooklyn, any trains that can't fit on the Broadway line would go over the Manhattan Bridge. Then they will loop through Lower Manhattan and then back out to Brooklyn. Finally, for the trains at Park Row, they would feed into another line under Center and Delancey Streets in Lower Manhattan. Then they would connect to the Essex Street station and run out there. In total, that was 3 separate through runs that the Brooklyn Rapid Transit Company proposed. And the Public Service Commission, who oversaw all of this planning, agreed with the plan. But when news of this reached the IRT, they crashed out so hard that they threatened to leave the dual contracts altogether. And that is why we have Queensboro Plaza in joint operation. Also during construction, the BRT made like 15 different modifications to the route. You can actually see the remnants of those changes, like at Canal Street. Anyway, by 1920, the first through-running line, Broadway, was finished. While it will be another 11 years for the loop through Lower Manhattan to open, and the Park Row to Essex Street connection never happened, that first through-running line on Broadway was extremely successful. Instead of ending their trains in the Lower East Side, the BMT can now circulate their trains in the city center, increasing overall BMT capacity, and decreasing crowding at Park Row. More one-seat rides were created, as instead of just serving a small slice of the Lower East Side, through running opened up large parts of Midtown Manhattan and Queens to Brooklyn residents. And planners tried to capitalize on that success by trying to incorporate more railroad lines. Another branch would have been built to incorporate the Staten Island Railway into the Manhattan through running system. But very quickly, planners realized Broadway was a victim of its own success. Trains on Broadway had to be lengthened to meet the demand. Twice. But even that wasn't enough, which is why even more train lines and connections were built to facilitate even more through running. And also why DeKalb Junction, which controlled this entire through running system, was grade separated to further increase capacity. Today, the setup is so ingrained in the New York City subway that no longer do you hear the Brooklyn Bath and the Coney Island Railroad, or the Brooklyn Flatbush and Coney Island Railway. Instead, you would say, I am taking the D train, or the B and Q train. And while there is still a ton of problems related to the Broadway line, returning to a time when there is no Broadway line, and by extension, no through running in Manhattan, is not going to make South Brooklynites very happy. So, if through running was such a massive success, what seems to be the holdup at Penn Station? Why can the BRT, who was responsible for abominations like this, and this, were able to figure this out in 1913, but not us in 2025? Especially when I remind you that the tunnels for through-running Penn Station already exist. Before I go any further and explain what is holding us back from embracing through-running at Penn Station, I want to introduce you all to the advocates who have way more extensive knowledge about this topic, and therefore can explain the problems and solutions way better than I can. This is Liam Blank. He is currently the chair of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee at the City Club of New York. He is also one of the biggest advocates for Penn Station through-running, and has uncovered a lot of historical documents related to through-running, in which we will explain later. This is Blair Lorenzo. She is currently the executive director at the Effective Transit Alliance, an organization that has written extensively about different transit issues in the New York metropolitan area, including a report on Penn Station through-running. And this is Khyber Sen. She was a contributor to the Effective Transit Alliance's report on Penn Station through running. She was also extremely patient in helping me record certain parts of the video and gave me extensive knowledge on how Penn Station works. Now, what are the problems that block through running at Penn Station? Well, Penn Station has three entities. The MTA, which operates the LARR and soon-to-be Metro North, New Jersey Transit, and Amtrak, and their respective networks are far from being conducive to being united.
One of the reasons Penn is so inefficient right now is that it has to be able to serve all sorts of trains. It has to be able to serve diesel electrics, but they're only running on electricity for that last little bit for the most part. It has to serve trains that can serve low platforms. What you really want to do is simplify this. You want all the trains to be electric, and you want them all to have high platforms.
And fixing those differences is easier said than done. Let's start with electrification. The MTA uses third rail power, while New Jersey Transit runs on catenary power. And even so, differences exist within each network's electrification systems.
You have the third rail overrunning for Long Island Railroad and underrunning for Metro North. And then you have overhead catenary at 60 hertz and at 25 hertz. That last one's the biggest issue because the M8 fleet, which is the train that you kind of want to base things on, the transformers on it can't currently do the 25 hertz.
Another one are the stations. The LARR standardized all of its stations to use high platforms by 1999. Meanwhile, on New Jersey Transit, come on, what is this? Labor requirements also vary throughout the LARR, New Jersey Transit, and Amtrak, which means what would happen to workers when they leave their own respective network? How would they get paid, for example? Not to mention, there are challenges at Penn Station itself. Some of the platforms here are narrow. So if you started running even more trains at Penn Station, fixing Penn Station circulation needs to be a top priority. And that is not going to be cheap.
There's the NFPA, the National Fire Protection Code, Section 130, which is all about mass transit. And everyone needs to be able to clear a platform in something like 4 or 6 minutes. And Penn today doesn't meet this requirement. It was, Penn was obviously much older than this requirement.
However, the obstacles to through running Penn Station are not insurmountable. For example, trains exist that can run on both catenary and third rail. In fact, the BRT used these trains to allow the South Brooklyn railroads, which used overhead wire at the time, to through run with their elevated network, which used third rail power. In 1900.
There's basically no cost premium. I mean, it's a rounding error. It's not, to have a train that can run basically on every power system that you have. Some people confuse it with locomotives that can run on both electricity and diesel, and those tend to actually end up being a lot more expensive because the diesel equipment is just so expensive to maintain and do.
And as for the differences with over and under running third rail, or the 60 versus 25 hertz catenary, well, you can design new trains for that.
Going forward, they should look into buying new trains that are like the M8s, but can also use 25 hertz catenary and have a transformer for that. We think this is definitely possible, and it's not really more expensive. The M8s are cheaper than the M7s and M9s, which are not dual voltage. But in the more immediate future, since it does take time to design and procure a new train, New Jersey Transit's most of their rolling stock is able to run through Penn Station access already.
Yes, some work needs to be done to convert these low platforms into high platforms in New Jersey, but that is an investment well worth it.
I mean, first off, that's much better service. If you've read Nolan Hicks's Momentum report for accessibility, obviously, but you can board and deboard people so much faster. The trains go faster. This is the type of ongoing improvement that you do slowly over a period, and it makes service better all the way through.
As for labor differences, they don't need to be rebuilt from scratch. Instead, you could have crew exchanges at Penn Station, so that the train crews would stay within their own agency.
The train continues through at Penn Station, but Metro North crew get off and the New Jersey Transit crew get on, and the passengers don't notice any difference.
Finally, there are ways to improve Penn Station circulation, and that work doesn't need to be disruptive, as it could be phased. The truth is, while technical specifics matter, we already know what to do to through-run Penn Station, and we are not unique in having those technical problems. Many through-running systems have the same challenges we do, like different electrification systems, labor agreements, and other standards. Like Thameslink in London, where similar to Penn Station, united a catenary network with a third rail network.
They solved it with like a dual mode trains that they ordered. And it was like so obvious that like getting rid of the downtown terminal and, linking these two systems together was going to unlock so much efficiency that it didn't even trigger their requirements for environmental review, which is fascinating.
So if other systems managed to figure this out, why haven't we? What exactly is missing that will finally get us to adopt the gold standard of running trains and solve a critical problem at Penn Station? One answer. If you want an answer as to why we can't get the most basic solutions to our problems, politics is your answer. And education, but mostly politics, especially in New York City, where it is somehow a debate between an actual transit solution and a Walmart High Line. Build a Queenslink and no way with Queensway. Now, add on multiple entities that can't seem to get their act together, and you get the fiasco that is Penn Station. All three entities have, at one point or another, been opponents of through-running, and Amtrak was historically the biggest opposition to this. So much so that in multiple studies, Amtrak refutes the contention that through-running does not increase capacity, which is false.
So at Penn Station, currently, dwell times are very long, and the commuter railroads and Amtrak think they have to be extremely long, even longer than they actually are in practice usually. Amtrak thinks all the trains going through Penn Station need a dwell time of 22 minutes, even if they through run. So even if they don't have to turn around and do all the extra brake tests and everything for that. Basically, everything about Penn Station's capacity hinges on the dwell time. If you can lower that, there's so much more you can do with each platform and each track.
We see trains go through or turn Penn right now much faster than that. We talk about PATH trains. PATH is a FRA regulated railroad. It has to follow all the same, it's got some exemptions, but for these issues has to follow the same exemptions, and they turn trains in in 4 or 5 minutes.
So, why does Amtrak insist on dwell times being over 20 minutes? Well, because they insist that if they run trains every 2 or 3 minutes, then that will create dangerous crowding conditions, which is another misleading claim.
There's no doubt that the platforms at Penn are really crowded, but they're crowded the same way subway platforms are crowded. We went and we measured people getting off the trains, and we measured their speed and how quickly, and we found that within 3 minutes, people clear the platform from a train. There's always stragglers, but the platform clears within 3 minutes, which gives you plenty of room for a rational turn time, even with just the vertical circulation you have now.
And with Penn Station having multiple platforms, more than one platform can be dedicated to through-running, which means through-running trains have multiple platforms to dump their passengers, making 22-minute dwell times unnecessary to contain crowding levels.
You add more vertical circulation, you make it even easier because you get people off the platform a lot faster.
But those wrong parameters haven't stopped Amtrak from touting their own plan. And their own plan was Penn Station South, a project that aims to expand the number of tracks and platforms, and therefore capacity, at Penn Station. But that concept of a plan would have built on the mistakes of Penn Station. More tracks and platforms, more of a reason to dwell their trains 15 to 20 minutes at a time. After all, why are you in a hurry to rush these trains out to a yard when there are more tracks to send trains to? Even if dwell times were reduced, the fact that Penn Station is a terminal station means conflicting train movements, which means delays, which cuts into capacity. Moreover, Penn Station South does not open up the region the same way that through-running would. Despite travel between the tri-state area being extremely convoluted, it still happens frequently. Very frequently, might I add. Through-running is perfectly suited for that job, as one can get from New Jersey to Long Island without switching trains. Not only is it good for, reducing traffic on nearby highways like the Cross Bronx Expressway, which a ton of their traffic is through traffic, but also for opening more of the region to development and jobs. And finally, the price tag for Penn Station South is nearly $17 billion, which is astronomical. I am no engineer, but I am pretty sure that the costs associated with through running, whether it be buying new trains, reconfiguring and rehabilitating Penn Station, standardizing platforms throughout New Jersey, fixing up tracks, grade separating key junctions like at New Rochelle, and building new yards is not only way cheaper than $17 billion, but also be much more positive to the rider experience than a bloated new station. In short, if we have gone through Amtrak's concept of a plan, we will be paying nearly $20 billion to repeat the exact same problem, which is to further isolate each network instead of trying to integrate them together for more capacity and more one-seat rides. And that might be the point.
Amtrak really wanted Penn expansion. And there are people in Amtrak still, I think, who really want Penn expansion. Railroading tends to be a very change-averse industry. People just want to keep doing what they're doing. And if you can just build, rip down a block of Midtown and build a bunch of tracks, well, that is one way to just let the railroad keep doing what it's doing the way it's always done it, and you don't have to change and you don't have to do anything.
However, even if Amtrak changes their mind, it still wouldn't matter at all. That is because Amtrak is only one of 3 entities that operate at Penn Station, and it is not their decision to make alone. They need to get the MTA and New Jersey Transit to cooperate as well. Cooperation would mean concessions, and historically, the governor of New York, which controls the MTA, and the governor of New Jersey, which controls New Jersey Transit, does not want to give up their powers.
They're each defending their own institutional turf. They really prefer pouring billions of dollars into like a single concrete massive overbuild capital project. Concrete projects expand their individual empires, while cooperation requires a surrender of autonomy to an extent.
And that is the real problem: governance. Specifically, a lack of a powerful single entity that can force these 3 entities to act as one at Penn Station and undergo the necessary actions to through run. After all, think about what through running is. You are uniting separate, disconnected commuter rail systems, each with their own standards and whatnot, into one cohesive network. So of course, bureaucracy needs to be resolved before we even think about through running. That is why in the attempts to introduce through running, there is always some proposal to create a new entity that could force these agencies to work together. For example, in the case of the Southern Brooklyn Railroads, it only became feasible when a singular entity, the Brooklyn Rapid Transit Company, bought them all out. And in the case of Penn Station, whenever there were plans to through run, there was always a plan to merge governance structures, such as the Metropolitan Transit District proposal in 1958, something Liam Blank uncovered in his research on this topic.
The Metropolitan Rapid Transit Commission was created in 1954, basically to solve what they called the crises of the Trans-Hudson commute. The private railroads were failing. The New Jersey commuters still needed a way to get to New York. And the solution that they came up with, which actually mirrored a solution that was already developed in the 1920s by chief engineer Daniel Turner, was the creation of a through-running loop system. But more importantly than that, their project director, Arthur Page, who interestingly is a communications expert they brought in to basically sell to the public this new concept of what he called a Metropolitan Transit District. What that was it was going to be like another bi-state entity, like the Port Authority, except it was going to be explicitly mandated to solve the rail issue across the Hudson, which the Port Authority had basically given up on trying to include within its scope of work. Had they done this, we would have had a entity that would have basically created a through running system and built it for $400 million, which is crazy, including new tunnels under the Hudson. And it would have had a unique governance structure that is unlike the Port Authority, and it was very forward looking for its time. And it's still one that might actually be valuable or applicable today. But basically, the people who live within the bi-state district, which included New York County, Manhattan, and 10 New Jersey counties, northern New Jersey counties, and I think like Rockland and Orange County. The people who live within that district would essentially directly elect representatives who would be on the board of the Metropolitan Transit District agency. Essentially, if you think about it, it's like if the people who live in New York could, basically have direct say over who leads the MTA, that would change, I think, the whole nature of how the MTA responds to its customers and how people view the MTA, for example. So it would become much less opaque and you would have direct accountability.
However, despite support from both the governors of New York and New Jersey, the legislation was stalled in the New Jersey State Assembly. Then a storm of opposition came about raising property taxes to pay for the new service, and disagreements over the member structure, which ensured the failure of through running.
So they ultimately decided we're going to go on a state-by-state basis and do what we can within the power of each governor. It took a couple iterations, but essentially what we have today, where they consolidated like a couple bankrupt railroads. The Triborough Authority, which was led by Robert Moses, had a huge revenue that it was sitting on. Now basically subsidizes the previously bankrupt railroads using the surplus revenue of the Triborough Authority, all under now the MTA structure.
However, New York thrives on being very unpredictable. After all, in a fast-paced city, you can experience every possible combination of events in under 1 year. And the situation regarding Penn Station is no different. In April, Janno Lieber, the head of the MTA, announced his support for through running, reversing years of MTA rhetoric against the idea. Around the same time, Andy Byford was appointed to oversee reconstruction efforts at Penn Station. Andy Byford is not only an amazing bureaucrat that can fix subway systems, but is also a massive advocate for through running, especially at Penn Station.
His support of operational improvements, very much including through running. In his experience in London, he worked on Thameslink and on the Elizabeth line, so he's single-handedly the expert on through running. If there's anyone to know whether or not through running can be done at Penn Station, it should be, the guy who's famous for implementing it in London and also working on it in Toronto.
And finally, and this is the big one, Penn Station was federalized. What this meant in practice was that the federal government could now force the state governments to work together on through running, overcoming a major bureaucratic obstacle. And while I am extremely skeptical of whatever this administration does, I am surprised they are moving quickly on through running Penn Station. By their timeline, the hope is to finish all studies in bureaucracy-related matters and start construction by the end of 2027.
Andy Byford confirmed that the previous plan to demolish an entire city block, Block 780, in order to build the massive southern expansion that the railroads preferred, that project is, in his words, being put on hold. In July, Byford announced that the Federal Railroad Administration will commission an independent service optimization study, through running study, to reevaluate how trains operate in and out of the existing station, which was a key demand from through running advocates, myself included. So our job now is to hold them to it.
Hopefully, these new efforts at Penn Station translate into something good. Namely, that we finally get a solution that is tailored to the needs of the 21st century, which is through running.
It cost 25 billion pounds or whatever to build the Elizabeth line. It has proven its worth a ton over. We can do that without having to spend that, and that's amazing.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for watching this video. I do want to extend a thank you to both Liam Blank and Blair Lorenzo for both being big advocates for through running and agreeing to do this interview. I also want to thank Khyber for helping me understand the nuances of Penn Station. Finally, I want to thank Jeffrey for coming up with the through running that exists in our subway system and allowing me to use that observation in this video. And yeah, if you like this video, consider liking and subscribing. And I'll see you all in the next video.